So what I wanted to do with this screencast is talk about something that I've actually been trying to do for a couple of years, which is to recreate the theme song from He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. I know that sounds kind of like a stupid, weird, maybe even childish thing to do, but it's kind of fun, and I've always liked that theme song. The first time I tried this was originally I think it was with my old Roland XP80 keyboard back several years ago. But then after I got Contact back in 2008, I decided to try it again. And originally I had just used the Contact Factory libraries, and the result wasn't that good. Part of the problem was the fact that I was new to the sampling world. I had the Contact Factory library and nothing else. And the Contact Factory library is pretty decent in some areas, but not in other areas. Part of the problem also was the way I had done the EQ and reverb and compression. And so I'm going to talk a little bit today about both the individual MIDI parts that I've created here and the instruments that the sample libraries that I've used to go with them. And also, I recorded each of the individual MIDI parts as audio and applied different compression to them and also some amp effects on the bass here, and then bust everything out to a reverb. But I tried to keep things fairly dry, actually, when I recorded them into Pro Tools as audio files. So I guess the first thing I want to do is play for you what I have. I used the Spitfire solo strings libraries to do the string sounds, and even though those are meant for solo strings, by combining some different patches together, I was able to get kind of a small section sound, which is what I wanted. That's what I used for the main strings, the main violins that you hear, and then I'll talk a little bit more about what I did for some of the other string parts and for the brass parts. So the first thing, like I said, that I wanted to talk about is the violin sounds, because I found that was the hardest thing to get right. And so I actually combined two different libraries. I used the Kirk Hunter strings library, which I've had for quite some time, the solo strings, to record one violin line. And then also, the majority of the violins come from the Spitfire solo strings library. And so the Spitfire solo strings are obviously solo strings, and in the original Masters of the Universe theme song, there's kind of a small string section playing. And so I achieved that effect by combining a couple different solo strings patches. Now, part of the reason for that also is that the Spitfire solo strings have a couple different types of legato, and no individual type of legato was appropriate for the sound that I wanted. If you listen, let me solo out just the Spitfire solo strings. There are a couple of fast runs in there, and no individual patch was really appropriate for those fast runs. There's the portamento legato, there's the regular legato, and then there's the bow change legato. And all of those different legatos had different aspects to them that I liked. And I also liked the sound of the sustain patches. So I combined those 4 different patches together to kind of get the appropriate sound of the runs that I wanted. I also layered in the marcato patch with that because it gave it that nice, sharp, crisp sound, especially on some of the other, not the fast runs, but maybe some of the slightly slower parts, like I think maybe right here. That last part there, that sounds really good with the marcato built in, I think. And so that's how I did the main string part. But to that, I also added the Kirk Hunter solo strings library. I like the sound of that library, even though a lot of people don't. But really, by itself, it didn't quite do the job. So if you listen to just the Kirk Hunter strings by themselves, and that actually sounds pretty good. I like the sound of those, but I did want the sound of a string section, so I wanted to layer a couple different things together. So you get something like this. I should also mention that I pushed the Kirk Hunter strings ahead just slightly after I recorded the audio file. So the MIDI data was quantized, but I pushed the Kirk Hunter strings ahead just slightly. And then when everything's in the full mix, that helps make the strings stand out a little bit and makes them sound not so much like individual strings that are just layered together, and it makes them sound a little bit more like a section of strings. If you want to hear that one more time, that sounds like this. Also, there are some other string parts going on in there that you might have heard. These staccato strings are actually a combination of 2 different libraries. They're a combination of the Session String Pro libraries, which are also a small section sound, and again, the Spitfire solo strings library. So along with the Session Strings Pro marcato, I layered in the solo strings marcato from the Spitfire solo strings, and you get a sound like this. So I should mention, to make everything as small as possible and get rid of as much reverb as possible, on the Spitfire solo strings you have a choice of several different mic positions, or actually 3 different mic positions. I chose the close mics. And Session Strings Pro, I used one of the smaller sounding reverbs. I did a version of this also where I had more reverb, and I think it might have actually sounded a little bit better, but it sounded farther from the original, and I liked the sound of the smaller hall and less reverb. So the legato patches with the Spitfire solo strings don't give you the option of using different mic positions, but they do give you the option of trimming off those reverb tails to get a smaller hall size. So I brought the hall size down on the legato patches, and for the multi-mic patches where the different articulations are, I chose the close mics. So if you want to hear all the strings together, you get something like this. The next thing I want to talk about is the brass. The brass was actually the thing that really kept me from having realism in the past, more so than I had realized. I used to use, like for example, when I was using the contact brass patches, or the contact brass library, I didn't have any dynamic control over the brass after you played a note. So I would play a note, and then whatever dynamics you would use to play the note, it would be held at that dynamic. With Cinebrass, which is what I use for this, you can control the dynamics through the mod wheel if you choose to. And so that's what I did. And it allows you to have some crescendos and decrescendos that really just add a lot more realism to the whole thing. So first of all, if we listen to just the Cinebrass brass, it sounds like this. And I should mention, again, with Cinebrass, you have the choice of several different mic positions. I chose the close mic positions. The original version I did used the farther mic positions, the ambient or whatever the choices are, the mic positions with more reverb in them. And to replicate that smaller sound, I turned those way down and switched just to the close mics. And of course, once I did that, that threw off the dynamics of my entire recording, because the original recording I made had one set of mic positions. The second recording I made, which is the one you're hearing now, had a different set of mic positions. And so I had to go through and readjust some of the volumes of these audio files. Originally, I'd set everything to the volume that I wanted in MIDI, and also to the panning that I had wanted for the things that I panned, which I think was just the bass, actually. But then when I switched over to audio, I had to reset some of these volumes. So in addition to Cinebrass, actually, there's one other thing that I used, which is a free trumpet sound that I found a long time ago for Giga. And unfortunately, I don't remember who made it or how to find it at this point. But I thought it was a very nice solo trumpet sound for free. There are actually 4 different dynamic layers and a couple different articulations. Only one of the articulations had the 4 dynamic layers. The others just had 1. But it's a pretty neat sounding trumpet. So I layered that together with the Cinebrass ensemble trumpet sound, and I got something like this. So the Cinebrass is being controlled by the mod wheel, and that free trumpet that I had can't be controlled by the mod wheel. You just have to, it just plays at whatever dynamic you press the key with. And so the part where that free trumpet really shines is over here, where you hear the So the free trumpet is the one that's really giving it that punchy sound, which is kind of what I wanted. So for the bass, I used the new core bass library, or the new Orangetree bass library from Orangetree Samples. And I had all of the original Orangetree bass stuff, but he released this new library that was a free update if you had all the original stuff, where it combined all of the different bass articulations into one patch, and it also added another dynamic layer to make it more realistic. So what I did here is I turned off the amp effects and the compression that I had added through Pro Tools. I still had added some compression through Contact, but I turned off all the compression through Pro Tools, so you can hear just what that bass you can hear what that bass sound sounds like by itself. Oops, got to solo it out. So that buzzing sound in the higher dynamic layer is just great because that wasn't there before in the original version of the Orangetree bass libraries. And so that adds a whole extra level of realism to it, I think. I'm going to turn the amp effects back on and also the compression, and you can hear what it sounds like after that. So the amp effects and the compression just really make it cut through the mix a lot more. If you turn those off, it doesn't have quite the impact that it does when you have them turned on. So, I mean, if you can hear that through the full mix. Listen for the bass part. So the next thing I should talk about is the percussion, I guess. First of all, you can see right here I use the Epic Toms library from Tonehammer, which I guess now 8Dio makes those. My last video I talked about those also. They're great. I use them all the time for everything. But I also use Drumasonic to do the drum kit sounds. At the beginning I combined the Epic Toms with the drum kit sounds to kind of give it just, because you really hear that kick drum in the original recording, and I don't think it comes through quite as much in samples. So when you combine the Epic Toms with that, you get... Yeah, so those Epic Toms really add to the, epicness of the whole thing. So for the drum kit sound, I use Drumasonic, which has actually worked really well for me since I bought it. There are a couple things that maybe I don't like about it so much, like how it's hard or impossible to control the volume of the kit from MIDI, at least as far as I know. But it does give you a lot of control over the different, the volumes of all the different mics on the drums. It has... each drum is mic'd by all of the different microphones. Basically, you can control the volume individually of each one of those microphones for each drum. So it's a great library, and the moment I got it, it was a huge improvement over what I'd been using before, which was the Contact Factory library. And maybe when I did this, I didn't quite do it as much justice as I have some other times. But basically, what I like to do is separate all of the drum parts out into the different drums. So I have the kick drum on one track, the cymbals on another track, the snare on another track, and the toms on another track. And actually, originally when I do this, I record them all on the same track, which I've hidden over here. You can bring that back. See, it has all the drums there. And then I mute that out and hide it and just copy all of the individual drum parts to different tracks. And then I record those individually as audio and give them all slightly different compression. And you can control the volumes individually that way a little bit easier. So let's see, where do I have all the different drum parts as audio? So that maybe wasn't the best job I've ever done with drums, but it's decent, and actually they sound pretty good in the full mix, or they sound reasonably good in the full mix. Certainly a lot better than the Contact drum kit. I think this is the part I'm looking for. I love the sound of the toms in there. I'm running all of this audio out of my M-Box, which is, a cheap piece of hardware, and into the onboard sound card of my computer, which is an even cheaper piece of hardware, and that's how I'm doing the screencast. And last time I did this, I actually recorded, I just made a recording through Pro Tools of all of the music in my screencast, and then I pasted that back in later on. But I did it with Windows Movie Maker, which is just a horrible way to try to edit audio and video separately, and it took me forever to do it. So I'm just going to be lazy this time and use this audio for this video. And if you want to hear better audio, you can go to a dedicated video I'll put up with a recording of this theme song here. Lastly, I purchased the new Adagio Strings library from 8Dio, which they just came out with the violins, and I'm really looking forward to when that's going to be released. But I bought it on pre-order, so it should be coming out sometime in February. I'm thinking about redoing this with those Adagio strings, although I probably have better things to do with my time and better musical things to do with my time too. But I'm really curious to see how this would sound with that, because I feel like the strings on this have been harder to replicate, at least for me, than a lot of other things, even trying a few different libraries. So maybe I'll put up a recording of that in a few weeks or a month or so or something like that.